Imagine standing on the walls of a city, watching the horizon burn red with fire. The ground trembles as an army unlike anything Europe has seen before advances toward your gates. You hear the thunder of drums, the blare of horns, and the chants of tens of thousands of soldiers who have come with one mission: to erase your world and replace it with theirs. This is not a small skirmish. This is not a border raid. This is the Ottoman Empire, at the very height of its power, bringing 150,000 men to the gates of Vienna, the very heart of Europe. And inside the city, a desperate, starving population, hopelessly outnumbered, their walls shaking with every blast of cannon fire, clinging to the belief that reinforcements will come before it is too late. But what followed was something no one could have predicted. In one of the most astonishing moments in military history, a coalition of Christian forces just 80,000 strong marched against impossible odds, rallied by the leadership of one man, King John III, Sobieski of Poland. What happened next became legend, the largest cavalry charge in history, the clash of civilizations at their breaking point, and the moment Europe itself teetered on the edge of conquest or survival. This was the Battle of Vienna, 1683. To understand why this battle mattered so much, we must first step back into the 17th century, a time when Europe was fractured, vulnerable, and uncertain. The Protestant Reformation had torn Christendom apart, dividing kingdoms that once stood united. The 30 Years' War had devastated vast swaths of Central Europe, leaving cities in ruin, populations diminished, and political trust shattered. The Habsburgs, rulers of Austria, were struggling to maintain order in their empire, facing not only external threats but also internal dissent. It was in this moment of weakness that the Ottoman Empire saw its opportunity. The Ottomans, under the rule of Sultan Mehmed IV, were the superpower of the age. Their armies stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans. Their fleets dominated the Mediterranean, and their wealth and prestige were unrivaled. Leading the charge in Europe was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man ambitious enough to dream of capturing Vienna, itself a city that symbolized the gateway to Western Europe. If Vienna fell, the road to Rome, Paris, and beyond lay open. For the Ottomans, Vienna wasn't just a city, it was the key to breaking Europe's spine. The siege began in the summer of 1683. The Ottomans surrounded Vienna with 150,000 men, far more than the defenders could ever hope to match. The city was defended by a garrison of just 15,000 soldiers and 5,000 volunteers, bolstered by civilians who had taken up arms. Day after day, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls, reducing stone to rubble, while sappers tunneled beneath the defenses, planting explosives to collapse the fortifications. Supplies ran thin. Hunger and disease stalked the city. The defenders knew they could not hold much longer. Every day that passed brought them closer to collapse. Yet, in their darkest hour, word spread of an approaching army. Across Europe, news of Vienna's plight had spread like wildfire. The Pope himself, Innocent XI, issued a desperate call for unity, a call that transcended old grudges, religious divisions, and political rivalries. Against all odds, leaders from across Christendom answered. Among them, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, rulers of various German states, and most crucially, John III Sobieski, the King of Poland. Sobieski was not just a king, he was a seasoned warrior, a strategist, and a commander whose reputation struck fear in his enemies. He would become the man Europe needed in its darkest moment. The relief force was no ordinary army. It was a patchwork of nations, languages, and banners of fragile alliance forged by desperation and faith. They numbered around 80,000, a force still vastly outnumbered by the Ottomans. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in determination, discipline, and the leadership of Sobieski. Their strategy was bold: to strike the Ottomans from the high ground, sweep down into their camp, and smash their forces before Vienna could fall. And so, in September 1683, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic clashes in history. The Ottomans, confident of victory, tightened their grip around Vienna. The defenders, exhausted and broken, prepared for the end. And on the hills of Kahlenberg, the Crusader coalition stood ready to gamble everything on a single, decisive battle. The story of the Battle of Vienna is not just about armies and generals. It is about survival, identity, and the collision of two worlds. For centuries, Europe had lived under the shadow of Ottoman expansion, watching as Constantinople fell, as Hungary was conquered, as wave after wave of soldiers poured across its borders. Vienna represented the line that could not be crossed, the final wall between East and West, between Islam and Christendom, between conquest and resistance. When 80,000 Crusaders marched to meet 150,000 Ottomans, they carried with them not only swords and banners, but also the fate of an entire civilization. This is the story of how courage, unity, and strategy turned the tide of history. This is the story of how an outnumbered army of Crusaders, led by one king and inspired by one cause, crushed the most powerful empire of its time. And this, above all, is the story of the Battle of Vienna, an epic showdown that would echo across the centuries. Stay with us as we dive into the siege, the strategies, the leaders, and the moment when the Winged Hussars thundered into legend. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the most powerful forces on earth. Its armies stretched across 3 continents, its fleets dominated the seas, and its rulers had long cast their eyes toward the heart of Europe. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had dreamed of expanding their dominion westward, of marching beyond the Danube and planting the crescent banner over the capitals of Christendom. They had already taken Constantinople in 1453, turning the jewel of Byzantium into their imperial capital, Istanbul. They had swept across the Balkans, conquering Serbia, Bosnia, and much of Hungary. Now, only one great obstacle remained: Vienna. Vienna was more than just a city. To the Ottomans, it was the gateway to Central Europe. Whoever held Vienna controlled the crossroads of trade and power, the bridge between East and West. Beyond Vienna lay the road to Bavaria, to the German states, to Italy, and ultimately to the beating heart of Europe, Rome itself. Capturing Vienna would not merely be a military victory, it would be a symbol, a triumph of Islam over Christianity, and a final crushing blow to the Habsburg dynasty that had long resisted Ottoman expansion. The man chosen to lead this audacious campaign was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, one of the most ambitious and ruthless figures of his age. Kara Mustafa was no ordinary commander. He was a man consumed by pride, driven by dreams of glory, and determined to carve his name into the annals of history, alongside great conquerors. To him, the conquest of Vienna was not simply an order, it was a destiny. The Sultan Mehmed IV entrusted him with supreme command, granting him authority to mobilize the empire's mightiest army in generations. In 1683, Kara Mustafa set his plan into motion. The Ottomans assembled a colossal host of nearly 150,000 janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, engineers, artillerymen, and auxiliaries from across their dominion. From Anatolia to Egypt, from the Black Sea to the Balkans, the empire poured its strength into this campaign. It was not just an army. It was a flood, a tide of warriors that no single European kingdom could hope to match. Alongside them marched tens of thousands of camp followers, supply trains, and herds of animals to feed the soldiers. It was a moving city of war, vast and unstoppable. For Kara Mustafa, the march on Vienna was more than strategy, it was ideology. He believed that Allah had destined the Ottoman Empire to expand without end, to carry the faith and power of Islam deep into Europe. His vision was fueled by a long-standing Ottoman tradition of conquest. Each generation of sultans had sought to push further west, testing the resolve of Europe's defenders. Vienna had already faced Ottoman armies once before, in 1529, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent laid siege to the city but failed to take it. That failure had burned in Ottoman memory for over a century and a half. Kara Mustafa saw himself as the man who would finally succeed where even Suleiman had not. But there was also another layer to Kara Mustafa's ambition: personal glory and political power. In the Ottoman court, success on the battlefield was the surest path to prestige. A victory at Vienna would make him a legend, perhaps even powerful enough to rival the Sultan himself. Yet his arrogance would prove dangerous. While most Ottoman generals sought to plunder conquered cities, Kara Mustafa dreamed of something greater. He envisioned Vienna not destroyed but preserved, a shining jewel to display as the new centerpiece of the empire. This obsession would later cloud his judgment, causing him to hesitate when ruthless decisiveness was needed most. The campaign began with overwhelming momentum. The Ottoman army surged through Hungary, crushing resistance and sweeping aside fortresses. Cities fell, villages were burned, and entire regions were left in ruins as the tide of war rolled ever closer to Vienna. Panic spread across Europe as news of the advancing army reached the courts of Christian rulers. Many feared that if Vienna fell, nothing could stop the Ottomans from pushing further into Germany, Italy, and beyond. The defenders of Vienna knew the danger all too well. They remembered the siege of 1529, when Suleiman's forces had battered their gates but failed to breach them. Now, facing a force nearly twice as large, they wondered if their walls could hold again. Inside the city, preparations were frantic. Food supplies were stockpiled, fortifications reinforced, and every man capable of bearing arms was called to defend the walls. But the truth was grim. The defenders numbered only around 20,000, facing an army more than 7 times their size. Still, Kara Mustafa remained confident. His scouts reported that the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had fled the city, abandoning it to its fate. The Ottomans believed Vienna was ripe for conquest, and that its fall was only a matter of time. As the Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon in July 1683, the siege began in earnest. For Kara Mustafa, this was not simply a military campaign, it was a statement of Ottoman dominance. He ordered elaborate encampments to be built around Vienna, complete with pavilions and decorations befitting an imperial triumph. He wanted the world to see not only the empire's power, but but also its wealth and grandeur. His soldiers dug trenches, planted cannons, and began the slow, relentless process of starving Vienna into submission. The Ottomans employed every weapon in their arsenal. Their artillery rained down fire on the city walls. Their sappers dug tunnels beneath the defenses, planting explosives to blast breaches open. Day by day, the defenders grew weaker, their supplies dwindling as disease and hunger spread through the population. Yet Kara Mustafa refused to unleash his full force in a single, decisive assault. Instead, he chose to wait, confident that Vienna would eventually collapse under the weight of the siege. What Kara Mustafa did not anticipate was the resilience of Europe. News of Vienna's plight sparked a reaction he had not expected. Pope Innocent XI called for a holy league, urging Christian rulers to set aside their rivalries and unite against the common threat. The Polish king, John III, Sobieski, answered the call, rallying an army that would march to Vienna's relief. German states, too, sent contingents, forming an alliance that Kara Mustafa had not foreseen. Thus, while the Ottomans tightened their grip, a storm was gathering on the horizon. Kara Mustafa's ambition had brought him to the gates of Vienna, but his arrogance and hesitation blinded him to the danger that now approached. The largest cavalry charge in history was about to descend upon his army, and with it, the shattering of his dreams of conquest. The ambition of the Ottomans, embodied in Kara Mustafa's campaign, was bold, immense, and nearly successful. It represented centuries of expansionist zeal, the hunger for power, and the vision of an empire that believed it was destined to dominate. Yet, like many great ambitions in history, it would meet its match not because of weakness in numbers, but because of the unity, courage, and sheer determination of those who refused to let Europe fall. By the summer of 1683, the thunder of war drums echoed across the Danube. The greatest army the Ottoman Empire had assembled in a century, nearly 150,000 strong, had descended upon Vienna. Their banners stretched across the horizon. Their tents sprawled like a sea of silk and canvas, and their cannons were positioned to tear down the walls of the Habsburg capital. The city, once a bustling hub of trade and culture, had become a fortress under siege, its fate hanging by a thread. The defenders of Vienna numbered barely 20,000, a mix of imperial troops, local militia, and desperate civilians pressed into service. They were commanded by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man known for both his discipline and his unshakable resolve. Starhemberg knew the odds were against him. Facing 7 times his number, he could not hope to defeat the Ottomans outright. His only strategy was survival, hold out long enough for relief forces to arrive, if they ever did. From the very first day of the siege, the Ottoman onslaught was relentless. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, master of the campaign, encircled the city with a precision that left no escape. Supply lines were cut, the roads were blocked, and every gate was watched. Ottoman engineers and sappers moved forward, digging trenches and tunnels that crept ever closer to the walls. The pounding of artillery became a daily torment, shaking buildings, collapsing ramparts, and filling the air with dust and fire. Inside Vienna, life descended into misery. Food supplies dwindled quickly as the siege dragged on. Bread was rationed to crumbs, and livestock that had been driven into the city before the Ottoman arrival were slaughtered in desperation. Disease spread among the population, fueled by hunger, poor sanitation, and the crowded conditions of those sheltering within the walls. Each day brought new casualties, not only from cannon fire and collapsing fortifications, but also from starvation and sickness. For many citizens, the siege felt less like a battle and more like a slow death sentence. The Ottomans, meanwhile, believed victory was inevitable. Their camp was a vast city of war, complete with markets, prayer tents, and luxurious pavilions for the officers. Kara Mustafa, supremely confident, envisioned Vienna as a prize too valuable to plunder. Unlike other Ottoman commanders, who might have stormed the city and sacked it in fire and blood, Kara Mustafa dreamed of capturing Vienna intact, its churches converted into mosques, its palaces turned into symbols of Ottoman triumph. But this obsession with preserving the city made him cautious. Rather than ordering an all-out assault, he relied heavily on siege tactics, believing time was on his side. Day after day, Ottoman sappers burrowed beneath the walls, planting gunpowder charges to blast breaches open. Time after time, the defenders launched desperate sorties to counter them. In brutal underground skirmishes, men fought in the dark with torches, swords, and daggers, trying to stop the enemy from collapsing their defenses. Many of these battles never saw the light of day, but they were no less decisive than the clashes on the walls above. Every tunnel destroyed was a brief reprieve. Every explosion that succeeded brought the defenders closer to ruin. The sounds of the siege became part of daily life in Vienna. The constant roar of cannons, the crack of muskets, the crash of falling stone, and, beneath it all, the faint but chilling sounds of Ottoman miners digging beneath the earth. Families huddled together, praying as dust sifted down from their ceilings. Soldiers stood guard on crumbling ramparts, watching the enemy campfires flicker across the night sky. For 2 long months, Vienna became a city of fear, endurance, and unbreakable will. Despite their suffering, the defenders refused to surrender. Count Starhemberg inspired his men with speeches that mixed faith and defiance. He knew that the fate of not just Vienna, but all of Europe might rest on their shoulders. Every day that Vienna held out was another day for relief forces to march to their aid. Yet, as the weeks dragged on, hope grew thin. Rumors spread among the defenders. Would the Polish king truly come? Could the Holy Roman Emperor rally his scattered forces? Or had Vienna been abandoned, left to face its doom alone? The Ottomans pressed harder. By late August, they had blasted massive sections of the walls, creating breaches wide enough for infantry to storm through. On multiple occasions, waves of janissaries surged forward, their war cries filling the air as they tried to pour into the city. But time and again, the defenders repelled them, fighting with muskets, pikes, and sheer desperation. Women and children carried water, repaired barricades, and even fought when needed. The siege had turned every citizen into a soldier. Still, exhaustion was setting in. Ammunition ran low. Powder stores dwindled. Food became nearly non-existent. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Dogs and even rats became meals of last resort. By early September, Starhemberg admitted that the city could not hold much longer. He sent desperate messages out by pigeon and secret couriers, pleading for aid. If reinforcements did not arrive soon, Vienna would fall. For Kara Mustafa, victory seemed assured. He allowed himself to dream of the moment when he would enter Vienna in triumph, presenting the city to Sultan Mehmed IV as a jewel of conquest. But his overconfidence blinded him to the danger building outside his camp. On the hills of Kahlenberg, just beyond his sight, the relief army of the Holy League was gathering 80,000 strong, led by the formidable King John III, Sobieski of Poland. As Vienna teetered on the brink of collapse, its defenders unaware of how close salvation had come, the Ottomans prepared for their final push. The siege had lasted nearly 2 months. The walls were shattered, the people broken, the defenders desperate. One last blow, Kara Mustafa believed, would deliver him victory. But destiny had other plans. On the morning of September 12, 1683, as the Ottomans readied their assault, the hills above them erupted with movement. The Crusader coalition had arrived, and with it came the battle that would decide not only the fate of Vienna, but the future of Europe itself. As the Ottoman cannons thundered outside Vienna, and its walls crumbled under the relentless siege, the fate of Europe hung by the thinnest of threads. For 2 months, the defenders had fought with a desperation born of inevitability. Inside the city, hope was fading, but beyond its besieged walls, a different kind of battle was being waged. A battle of diplomacy, faith, and unity. It was here that the seeds of salvation were planted. In the call for an alliance, unlike any Europe had seen in generations, at the center of this call stood Pope Innocent XI. The Pope had long warned that Europe was distracted by its internal quarrels, while the Ottoman Empire continued its march westward. For decades, Christian kingdoms had fought one another in civil wars, dynastic disputes, and religious feuds. Protestant and Catholic princes eyed each other with suspicion, their old wounds from the Reformation still raw. Yet, as news of Vienna's desperate plight reached Rome, Innocent XI recognized that the moment had come to set aside these divisions or risk watching. Christendom collapsed before the Ottoman advance. The Pope issued a plea. A Holy League must be formed. Old grievances had to be put aside. Kingdoms that once clashed on the battlefield must now stand shoulder to shoulder. Europe, fractured and weakened, could no longer afford to be divided. Vienna, he declared, was not only the key to Austria but the gateway to the heart of Europe. If Vienna fell, no fortress, no kingdom, and no throne would be safe. This was not merely an Austrian struggle, it was a struggle for civilization itself. Across Europe, his call resonated, though not without hesitation. Some rulers hesitated, wary of sending their armies into the jaws of the Ottoman war machine. Others were too embroiled in local disputes to spare men for the cause. But in Poland, one king stood ready. His name was John III, Sobieski, and he would become the figure history remembers as the savior of Vienna. Sobieski was no stranger to war. A seasoned commander, he had spent much of his reign defending Poland from invasions by Tatars, Cossacks, and Ottomans. He was a man of iron will and boundless energy, a leader who inspired loyalty not through fear but through his presence on the battlefield. His soldiers admired him, his allies respected him, and his enemies feared him. When the Pope's message reached Poland, Sobieski did not hesitate. He knew that if Vienna fell, Poland would soon face the Ottoman tide on its own borders. To defend Vienna was to defend Poland, and to defend Poland was to defend Europe. With this clarity, Sobieski answered the Pope's call. He pledged to lead his armies not merely as a Polish king, but as a Christian commander, bound by faith and duty. Under his command, Poland mobilized its finest warriors, including its most legendary force, the Winged Hussars, elite cavalry, whose charges had already become the stuff of legend. Sobieski's commitment electrified Europe. Inspired by his example, other rulers began to contribute. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, whose own capital lay under siege, rallied what forces he could. German princes sent contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia. Together, with Austrian forces and Sobieski's Poles, the Holy League army began to take shape. Yet unity did not come easily. These were men of different nations, languages, and traditions. Austrians and Poles had quarreled before. German princes distrusted one another. Alliances were fragile, and rivalries could have shattered the coalition before it marched. But the overwhelming threat of the Ottomans forced compromise. Leaders who once might have squabbled over borders now found common ground in survival. The Pope's envoys worked tirelessly to cement this fragile coalition. Gold was promised to fund the armies. Blessings were given, sanctifying the campaign as a holy endeavor. This was no longer just a war, it was a crusade, one final stand against the empire that sought to dominate Europe. By late summer, the alliance had gathered its strength. Around 80,000 troops assembled, an army smaller than the Ottoman host, but united by a cause greater than numbers. Sobieski, appointed commander-in-chief of the coalition, took on the burden of leadership with the confidence of a man who believed his cause was just and his mission was divinely ordained. The march to Vienna was no small feat. The relief army had to cross rivers, forests, and mountains, moving with both urgency and caution. Every day mattered. Within the city, time was running out. Reports from Vienna told of walls ready to collapse, food nearly gone, and defenders who could not endure much longer. Sobieski knew that hesitation meant disaster. He pushed his men forward with tireless determination, urging them onward with the promise that they were not just fighting for Vienna, but for the future of all Christendom. As they advanced, villagers and refugees greeted them with joy and desperation. To those who had seen their homes burned by Ottoman raiders, the sight of the Crusader army was a vision of salvation. For many, Sobieski himself became a figure of legend before the battle had even begun. A king who had left his own throne to fight for a cause greater than himself. By early September, the coalition reached the hills of Kahlenberg, overlooking the Ottoman camp and the besieged city beyond. From this vantage point, the Allies could see the vast Ottoman host spread out like a dark ocean around Vienna. The scale of the siege was staggering. Endless rows of tents, batteries of cannons, and the smoke of constant bombardment. Vienna looked broken, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse. To some, it seemed impossible that such a city could still hold. Yet it had, defying all odds, waiting for this very moment. Here, on the hills, the European alliance gathered its courage. Generals met, stratagems were drawn, and prayers were said. Sobieski himself climbed to the heights, surveying the battlefield. He knew the task ahead would not be easy. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, the Allies would have to strike with precision, timing, and overwhelming force. But he also knew that the Ottomans, after months of siege, were stretched thin, their confidence bordering on arrogance. Kara Mustafa believed victory was his. Sobieski intended to prove him wrong. The European alliance was more than a coalition of armies. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when division gave way to unity, when fear gave way to courage, and when faith overcame despair. Against the might of the Ottoman Empire, Europe had found its answer not in the walls of Vienna alone, but in the solidarity of nations that refused to let those walls fall. On the eve of battle, Sobieski is said to have written to his wife, telling her not to worry, for he went to war, not for glory, not for riches, but for God and Christendom. His words captured the spirit of the alliance. This was more than politics or survival, it was destiny. And so, with banners unfurled and weapons ready, the Allied army prepared to march down the slopes toward Vienna. Ahead of them lay the largest Ottoman army Europe had ever seen. Behind them lay the hopes of a continent. Their unity would soon be tested in the crucible of battle, in the clash that would decide the fate of nations. When the fate of Vienna and perhaps all of Europe hung in the balance, the very landscape itself became a weapon. Geography, often overlooked in the pages of history, played an immense role in shaping the course of the battle. In September of 1683, the Crusader army, a coalition of Poles, Austrians, and German allies, stood at the brink of destiny. Facing an Ottoman force nearly twice their size, they needed every possible advantage. That advantage came in the form of the Kahlenberg Heights, a rugged elevation overlooking the sprawling Ottoman encampments that ringed the besieged city of Vienna. From these heights, the Crusader commanders would orchestrate one of the most daring and decisive maneuvers in military history. But Kahlenberg was more than just a hill. It was a vantage point, a natural fortress, and a stage for the drama that was about to unfold. Rising above the Danube River valley, it provided clear visibility of the Ottoman camps, their artillery placements, and the weakening walls of Vienna. For King John III, Sobieski of Poland, the architect of the Christian relief force, The heights were not merely a staging ground, but a symbol of hope. To the weary Viennese defenders who had endured months of bombardment, disease, and starvation, the sight of banners fluttering atop Kohlenberg signaled that salvation was near. Securing this ground was not a matter of chance, but of deliberate calculation. Sobieski understood the value of striking from above. In warfare, height has always meant superiority. Archers can shoot further, cavalry can descend with terrifying momentum, and commanders can view the battlefield as though it were a living map. By claiming Kohlenberg, the Crusaders effectively turned the terrain into a weapon against their Ottoman adversaries. It gave them both a psychological and physical advantage, setting the stage for the largest cavalry charge in history. Yet the path to Kohlenberg was far from easy. The Allied army had marched long and hard to reach Vienna. The Poles, in particular, had covered hundreds of miles, their resolve tested by hunger, exhaustion, and the looming knowledge that they faced an enemy far greater in number. To reach the heights, the army had to navigate dense forests, narrow paths, and rugged terrain that slowed the progress of supply wagons and artillery. Scouts worked tirelessly to find routes suitable for cavalry, while engineers cleared paths for the heavy guns. The sheer determination to move tens of thousands of men, horses, and cannons into such a position speaks to the iron will of Sobieski and his commanders. From the Ottoman perspective, the presence of Crusader forces on Kohlenberg was an ominous development. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had devoted his attention to breaching Vienna's defenses. Believing the city's fall was imminent, he had not anticipated such a large relief army advancing so quickly, nor had he adequately fortified the approaches to the heights. The Ottomans, confident in their numerical superiority, were slow to react to this looming threat. This lapse in strategic foresight would prove catastrophic. Once established on Kohlenberg, the Crusaders carefully prepared for battle. Artillery pieces were positioned to harass Ottoman lines, while infantry formed ranks along the slopes, ready to descend in waves. The cavalry, particularly the famed Polish Winged Hussars, awaited their moment, their horses restless and their lances gleaming in the sun. Sobieski himself surveyed the field, recognizing that from this high ground, he could direct the battle like a grand chess match. Every Ottoman movement could be seen, every weakness identified, every opportunity seized. The morale of the Allied army soared. Soldiers who had once doubted their ability to face such a massive foe now drew strength from their position. Looking down upon the Ottoman encampments, sprawling with tents, siege engines, and smoke from cooking fires, they knew they held the upper hand in terrain, if not in numbers. The symbolism of the high ground cannot be overstated. It instilled confidence in the Crusaders while sowing unease among their opponents. On the eve of battle, Sobieski gathered his commanders. He laid out the plan of attack, a coordinated assault that would begin with infantry engagements and culminate in a devastating cavalry charge from the heights. His vision was clear. They would descend like a thunderstorm, breaking the Ottoman lines and lifting the siege once and for all. The men listened intently, aware that their actions would echo through history. When dawn broke on September 12, 1683, the battle commenced. From their elevated position, the Crusaders advanced with the momentum of the land itself. The infantry pressed forward, clashing with Ottoman forces who were caught off guard by the sudden ferocity of the attack. Cannons roared from the heights, bombarding enemy positions and disrupting their formations. As the day wore on, the Ottomans struggled to adapt, their vast numbers confined by the geography and their lines stretched thin. The decisive moment came in the afternoon, when Sobieski unleashed the cavalry from Kohlenberg. 20,000 horsemen thundered down the slopes, their charge magnified by the steep descent. The Winged Hussars, with their iconic wings rattling in the wind, led the assault. From above, they appeared like a wave crashing upon the Ottoman host, unstoppable and overwhelming. The sheer speed and power of the charge shattered the Ottoman morale, sending them fleeing in chaos. This dramatic turn of events was made possible by the choice of ground. Without Kohlenberg, such a maneuver would have been impossible. The hill gave the Crusaders not only a tactical edge, but also the psychological leverage to inspire their men and terrify their foes. The Ottomans, who had once believed themselves masters of the battlefield, suddenly found themselves fighting uphill, both literally and figuratively, against an enemy that had seized the natural advantage. In the aftermath of the battle, chroniclers and historians alike emphasized the significance of the high ground. It was not merely a matter of numbers or bravery, but of strategy. By occupying Kohlenberg, the Crusaders demonstrated a timeless principle of warfare. Control the terrain, and you control the battle. Sobieski's foresight in securing this position was as decisive as his leadership in executing the final charge. The Kohlenberg Heights remain a symbol of this turning point in history. To stand upon them today is to imagine the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the cries of men whose fates were sealed by the rise and fall of the land beneath them. The Battle of Vienna is remembered for its heroism and its epic scale, but at its core lies a simple truth. Sometimes, the ground you stand on determines the destiny of nations. The morning of September 12, 1683, dawned with an almost eerie stillness. For 2 long months, Vienna had endured the relentless pressure of siege, cannon fire tearing at its walls, tunnels dug beneath its defenses, hunger gnawing at the people within. The Ottomans, confident of victory, had settled into the belief that the city's fall was inevitable. Yet, on this day, the silence was broken, not by the sound of Ottoman guns, but by the stirrings of a massive Christian army poised for battle on the heights of Kahlenberg. The moment had come for a decisive clash, one that would determine the fate of Vienna and perhaps the destiny of Europe. From the ridgeline, the Allied commanders surveyed the battlefield. King John III, Sobieski of Poland, stood at the center of strategy and faith, a monarch known not only for his military brilliance, but for his personal courage. At his side were the commanders of the Holy Roman Empire's forces, including Charles of Lorraine, and German princes who had brought contingents of men from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia. Together, these leaders had forged a rare unity, setting aside political rivalries to face the existential threat posed by the Ottoman Empire. The Allied army numbered around 80,000, and though smaller than the Ottoman host, its strength lay in discipline, morale, and the careful coordination Sobieski had devised. Below them stretched a vast Ottoman encampment ocean of tents, banners, and siege works surrounding Vienna like a tightening noose. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, confident in his numerical advantage, had devoted most of his focus to breaching the city rather than preparing for the sudden onslaught that now loomed from the north. His army of roughly 150,000 men, including seasoned janissaries, cavalry, and artillery, was formidable. Yet they were caught at a disadvantage. Stretched thin by the long siege, spread out in a crescent around Vienna, and unprepared for the force descending upon them. At dawn, the first phase of the attack began. The Allied infantry and artillery advanced cautiously from Kahlenberg, pressing against the Ottoman flank. Bavarian and Saxon troops struck first, clashing with Ottoman soldiers positioned on the outer edges of the camp. Cannon fire erupted, shaking the valley and announcing that the battle for Vienna had truly begun. The Ottomans scrambled to meet this sudden offensive, their janissaries forming ranks while their cavalry maneuvered to counter the pressure. But the Christian artillery, carefully positioned on the high ground, rained destruction upon them, disrupting formations before they could fully respond. As the hours passed, the battlefield became a maelstrom of steel, smoke, and blood. The infantry fighting was brutal, with musketeers firing volleys at close range, followed by the crash of pikemen driving into Ottoman lines. The Ottoman defenders, fierce and experienced, resisted with determination. Yet, the sheer weight of the Allied advance, combined with the pounding of artillery from above, forced them backward, inch by inch. The Ottomans had the numbers, but the cohesion of the Allied forces, fighting shoulder to shoulder, commanded with precision, began to tell. By midday, the battle stretched along a wide front. The Austrians and Germans pushed from one side, while Polish troops under Sobieski pressed from another. The Ottomans fought valiantly, their cavalry darting in and out, their janissaries attempting counterattacks to stall the Christian momentum. But coordination faltered. Kara Mustafa Pasha, ensconced in his command tent, underestimated the scale of the attack. He believed that the city's defenses were still his main target, failing to grasp that the battle had shifted to a confrontation for control of the field itself. Then came the turning point. As the Allied infantry ground forward, clearing Ottoman positions one after another, Sobieski prepared the decisive stroke. The Polish Winged Hussars, the most feared heavy cavalry in Europe, had been waiting all day for their moment. Alongside them stood thousands of German and Austrian cavalry, restless and eager to charge. From their vantage point on the Kahlenberg slopes, they looked down upon the Ottoman lines stretched and fraying under the relentless infantry pressure. Sobieski saw the weakness, the cracks forming in the enemy's discipline. It was time. In the late afternoon, Sobieski gave the order. 20,000 cavalrymen surged forward, thundering down the slopes in one of the greatest charges ever recorded in history. The earth shook beneath the hooves, dust clouds rose like a storm, and the sun glinted off lances and sabers. At the head rode Sobieski himself, clad in armor, his presence inspiring his men to follow with unwavering ferocity. The Winged Hussars, their great feathered wings rattling like the roar of war drums, struck terror into the hearts of the Ottomans even before contact was made. The Ottoman lines, already battered, simply could not withstand the impact. The cavalry smashed into their ranks with devastating force, scattering infantry and overwhelming cavalry units that attempted to resist. Panic spread through the Ottoman camp. What had once been an organized siege army now dissolved into chaos. Soldiers fled, abandoning weapons, tents, and supplies. Siege works were left unfinished, artillery abandoned, and discipline collapsed entirely. Sobieski's charge was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a psychological earthquake. The very sight of tens of thousands of horsemen bearing down upon them broke the will of the Ottoman army. As Allied banners pierced deeper into the camp, Ottoman soldiers streamed toward the rear, desperate to escape annihilation. Kara Mustafa Pasha, realizing the disaster too late, ordered a retreat, but it was no orderly withdrawal, it was a rout. By evening, the battle was over. The Ottoman army had been shattered, its dreams of conquering Vienna destroyed in a single day of ferocious fighting. The city was saved, its defenders emerging from the battered gates to witness the ruins of the enemy encampment and the victorious Christian army standing triumphant on the field. The clash of September 12th was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point in history. The coordinated efforts of infantry, artillery, and cavalry, combined with the courage of tens of thousands of men who fought against impossible odds, had broken the power of one of the most formidable armies of its time. The victory was not merely tactical but symbolic. It marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe and the rise of a new era of Christian unity in the face of external threats. As Sobieski rode into Vienna that night, greeted as a savior, his words echoed across history. Venimus, venimus, dos Vesici. We came, we saw, God conquered. The Clash of Armies on that September day had not only lifted a siege but reshaped the destiny of a continent. The late afternoon sun of September 12, 1683, bathed the Kahlenberg Heights in a golden glow. The battle for Vienna had raged since dawn, with infantry and artillery pounding the Ottoman lines, slowly grinding down their strength. Smoke from cannons and burning siege works hung in the valley like a veil. Both sides were weary, their lines stretched and bloodied. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would echo across the centuries as one of the most breathtaking spectacles of warfare. It was the moment King John III Sobieski of Poland had been waiting for. For hours, he had held back his cavalry, watching as the Allied infantry pushed relentlessly against the Ottoman positions. The Germans, Austrians, and Poles had advanced step by step, reclaiming ground, battering the enemy, and forcing Kara Mustafa Pasha to commit more troops to the defense of his sprawling encampments. Now, at last, the time was right. The Ottoman lines were strained, their formations disrupted, their morale faltering under the combined pressure of artillery fire and infantry assaults. What they did not yet realize was that the true storm had not yet begun. Sobieski looked to his cavalry, drawn up on the slopes of the It was a sight to strike awe into friend and foe alike. 20,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry force assembled in Europe at that time, waiting in perfect discipline for the signal to charge. At their heart were the Polish Winged Hussars, the most feared heavy cavalry in Christendom. These warriors, clad in gleaming armor, carried long lances, sabers, and pistols, but it was their appearance that inspired terror. Each hussar bore great wooden frames adorned with feathers wings that rattled in the wind and roared in the thunder of galloping hooves. Too many enemies, they seemed less like men and more like avenging angels, descending from the heavens. The hussars were not alone. Beside them stood German and Austrian cavalry contingents, ready to join in the charge. But it was Sobieski himself, the Polish king, who would lead the way. Unlike many monarchs of the age, Sobieski was no distant commander. He was a warrior king, determined to ride at the head of his men and strike directly into the heart of the Ottoman host. He understood what was at stake, not merely the relief of Vienna, but the defense of Christian Europe itself. The king raised his hand, and the signal was given. Trumpets blared, drums rolled, and the massive cavalry began to move. At first, it was a slow trot, the riders aligning themselves into tight formations as they descended from the heights. Then the pace quickened into a gallop, then into a thunderous full charge. The ground shook beneath the weight of 20,000 horses, the noise like an earthquake rolling down the hills. Dust rose in great clouds, obscuring the horizon. To the Ottomans below, it must have seemed as though the very mountains themselves were descending upon them. The Ottomans, already struggling to hold their positions against the infantry, now faced the full fury of the greatest cavalry charge in history. Panic spread through their ranks as the wave of horsemen crashed down the slopes. The Winged Hussars struck first, their lances leveled, smashing into the Ottoman lines with unstoppable force. The impact was catastrophic. Cavalry and infantry alike were swept aside as though struck by a storm. Horses trampled men. Lances pierced armor. Sabers cut through the chaos with ruthless efficiency. Behind the Hussars came the Allied cavalry, pouring down in successive waves, magnifying the devastation. The Ottoman defenders, despite their valor, could not withstand the sheer speed and momentum of the charge. Their formations crumbled, discipline collapsed, and the once mighty siege army descended into chaos. Men fled in every direction, some throwing down their weapons, others crushed beneath the stampede. Sobieski himself rode at the forefront, his presence electrifying his men and terrifying his enemies. Chroniclers would later write of his bravery, describing how the Polish king led by example, striking directly into the thick of the fighting. To his troops, he was more than a commander, he was the embodiment of their cause, the living symbol of defiance against the Ottoman tide. The charge did not merely break the Ottoman lines, it shattered their spirit. What had been a siege army of 150,000, confident of victory, was transformed in a single hour into a panicked mass in full retreat. Kara Mustafa Pasha, watching in horror from his command post, realized the battle was lost. His carefully laid plans, his months of effort, his dream of planting the Ottoman crescent in the heart of Europol had been undone by the fury of the charge from Kohlenberg. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the battlefield belonged to the Allies. The Ottomans abandoned their camps, their artillery, their supplies. Tents were left standing, food uneaten, weapons discarded in haste. The Siege of Vienna, once so perilously close to success, was over in a single, decisive stroke. For those who witnessed it, the memory of the Winged Hussars' charge would never fade. Survivors spoke of the sound of wings rattling like thunder, of the unstoppable wave of horsemen descending from the heights, of the sheer terror it inspired in the hearts of the Ottomans. Historians would later call it the largest and most decisive cavalry charge in history, a maneuver that not only saved Vienna but changed the course of European history. The symbolism of the moment was profound. The Hussars, with their angelic wings, seemed to many contemporaries like instruments of divine will, heavens and warriors, who had come to deliver Vienna from destruction. For the people of the city, who had endured months of starvation and despair, the sight of the cavalry breaking the Ottoman army was nothing short of miraculous. In the years to come, the Winged Hussars' charge would become legendary, celebrated in song, art, and chronicles. It was not just a military maneuver, but a cultural memory, a defining moment of polish and European identity. It stood as proof that courage, faith, and unity could overcome overwhelming odds. And yet, beyond its symbolism, the charge was a masterpiece of military timing and execution. Sobieski's patience in holding back his cavalry until the perfect moment, his decision to launch them from the high ground of Kohlenberg, and his personal leadership at the head of the charge all combined to create a victory. That was as brilliant in strategy as it was dramatic in spectacle. As dusk settled over the battlefield, Sobieski entered Vienna to the sound of church bells ringing in triumph. He was greeted not as a conqueror, but as a savior. To the Viennese, he was the man who had lifted the shadow of annihilation. To Europe, he was the king who had halted the advance of the Ottoman Empire at its peak. And to history, he would forever be remembered as the commander who led the greatest cavalry charge the world had ever seen. The thunder of the cavalry charge still echoed across the battlefield when the Ottoman army, once so mighty and confident, began to unravel. What had started as a siege poised on the brink of victory now turned into a catastrophic rout. The largest cavalry charge in history, led by John III Sobieski and his Winged Hussars, had smashed directly into the heart of the Ottoman lines with such violence that the defenders could not recover. The shock was immediate, the effect irreversible. The Ottoman army, numbering nearly 150,000 strong, was being torn apart before its commanders could even attempt to rally them. The speed and ferocity of the charge struck the Ottomans like a lightning bolt. For months, they had encircled Vienna, believing the city's collapse was only days away. Their siege works were advanced, their tunnels dug beneath the walls, their artillery battering the defenders with daily bombardments. Confidence had turned into arrogance. Kara Mustafa Pasha had already envisioned the triumphant march into Vienna, the spoils of conquest, and the prestige of delivering Europe's gateway city to the Ottoman Sultan. Yet in a matter of hours, all that ambition crumbled. The first Ottoman units struck by the charge disintegrated almost instantly. Janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, who had withstood countless battles before, were unable to maintain their ranks against the sheer momentum of the Winged Hussars and allied cavalry. The impact scattered them like chaff in the wind. Panic rippled outward, spreading faster than any order could contain it. Soldiers looked to their commanders for guidance, but many officers themselves were caught in the chaos, unable to reorganize amidst the fury of hooves, sabers, and lances cutting through their lines. The Ottoman cavalry attempted to countercharge, but their formations were too disordered, their morale already shaken. Riders were thrown back, horses trampled, and discipline collapsed in the face of the Polish onslaught. The Ottoman artillery, positioned to break the walls of Vienna, now became useless. Gunners abandoned their pieces, fleeing before the relentless advance. Cannons that had pounded Vienna for weeks now stood silent, their crews scattered or dead. Kara Mustafa Pasha, from his command tent, watched as his army, his great host assembled from across the empire, fell apart before his eyes. At first, he refused to believe what he was seeing. For hours, he had been confident that the Ottomans could resist the Allied infantry's advances, that the Christian army would eventually exhaust itself against his superior numbers. But Sobieski's timing had been perfect. The cavalry had struck at the precise moment when his men were stretched thin and exhausted. The Grand Vizier, paralyzed by indecision, failed to issue clear orders. Instead of rallying his forces, his hesitation deepened the chaos. As the Christian cavalry penetrated deeper into the Ottoman encampments, the collapse accelerated. Tents were torn apart, siege works abandoned, and thousands of soldiers fled in terror. Supplies that had been painstakingly hauled across the empire, food, weapons, even luxuries for the commanders, were discarded in haste. The campfires that had once signaled Ottoman dominance now burned untended, as men scrambled to escape the slaughter. The ground was littered with overturned wagons, shattered weapons, and the bodies of the fallen. For the defenders of Vienna, emerging from their battered city, the sight was astonishing. Only hours earlier, they had prepared themselves for the possibility that the city would fall. Now they watched as their besiegers, once seemingly invincible, collapsed into utter disarray. To them, it must have seemed like a miracle, the hand of God striking down the enemy in an instant. Church bells rang out, voices cried in jubilation, and the tide of despair that had gripped the city for months lifted in a single, extraordinary reversal of fortune. The rout soon turned into a slaughter. The Christian cavalry, still surging forward, cut through Ottoman ranks as they fled. Riders pursued stragglers, cutting down any who resisted. Streams of soldiers abandoned their posts, leaving behind artillery, siege engines, ammunition, and massive stockpiles of supplies. In their haste, the Ottomans even left behind their famed green standard, the sacred banner of the Prophet, a humiliation that would haunt Kara Mustafa Pasha and the empire for generations. By nightfall, the battlefield was a scene of devastation. The once grand Ottoman host was gone, replaced by pockets of terrified survivors scattered across the countryside. Thousands lay dead, while tens of thousands fled in disorganized bands, trying desperately to regroup. What had been an army of conquest only that morning was now a broken force in full retreat. Kara Mustafa Pasha himself retreated from the field, his dream of glory shattered. He carried with him not the laurels of victory, but the shame of defeat. His hesitation, his overconfidence, and his failure to anticipate the speed of the Allied counterattack had doomed the Ottoman campaign. Within months, the consequences of his failure would reach the Ottoman court, where his disgrace would seal his fate. The collapse of the Ottoman army at Vienna was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological catastrophe. For decades, the empire had been seen as the unstoppable power pressing deeper into Europe. The crescent advancing against the cross. But at Vienna, that image was shattered. The myth of Ottoman invincibility died on the fields outside the city walls. From that moment forward, the balance of power began to shift. The Ottoman advance permanently halted, and the Christian states emboldened to strike back in what would become the Great Turkish War. For the Allies, the aftermath was a triumph unlike any other. They walked through the abandoned Ottoman camps, marveling at the wealth left behind. Gold, silver, food, silks, and exotic luxuries. But perhaps more valuable than the treasures were the weapons and artillery now in their possession. Vienna had not only been saved, but had been enriched by the spoils of victory. The men of the Holy League celebrated, not merely as soldiers who had fought bravely, but as participants in a battle that would be remembered for centuries as the turning point of an age. The collapse of the Ottoman army also carried deep symbolic weight. For many in Europe, the battle was seen not just as a victory of men, but of faith itself. Sobieski's words as he entered Vienna captured this sentiment perfectly. Venomous. Vigimus. Deus vici, we came. We saw. God conquered. The Ottoman rout was seen as divine judgment, a sign that heaven had favored the defenders of Christendom. The legacy of the Ottoman collapse at Vienna endured long after the dust of battle had settled. It marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long decline, a decline from which it would never fully recover. The Christian states, once fractured and fearful, now saw the possibility of pushing the Ottomans back. Vienna became not only a city saved, but a symbol of resilience, its name forever linked with the moment Europe turned the tide against Ottoman expansion. In the silence of the battlefield, after the rout, one could imagine the ghosts of ambition lingering in the abandoned tents, the echoes of panic still reverberating where thousands had fled in terror. The Ottoman collapse was complete, and its consequences would ripple across history. What had begun as the empire's boldest bid for dominance in Europe ended in humiliation, defeat, and retreat, a reminder that even the mightiest armies can crumble when their spirit is broken. The year was 1683, and the thunder of war had echoed across the heart of Europe. When the smoke cleared on the battlefield outside Vienna, the world had changed forever. The defeat of the Ottoman army was not just a victory for the Christian coalition. It was a decisive moment that reshaped the trajectory of European history. The clash on the Kahlenberg Heights became more than a dramatic military. Episode 8 marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe and a profound shift in the balance of power that would reverberate for centuries. For nearly 300 years, the Ottoman Empire had been the nightmare of Christendom. From the fall of Constantinople in 1453 through the conquest of the Balkans, Hungary, and beyond, the Ottomans had seemed unstoppable. The Sultan after Sultan extended the empire's influence, pushing deeper into European territory, always testing the borders of Christendom. Vienna, sitting at the crossroads of East and West, was the gateway to Europe's core. Twice the Ottomans had laid siege to the city, and twice its fate hung by a thread. But in 1683, the tide finally turned. What had seemed inevitable, the advance of the Crescent over the continent, was stopped in dramatic fashion. The Battle of Vienna did not merely save one city, it saved the cultural and political heart of Europe. Had the Ottomans succeeded, the road to Central and Western Europe would have been wide open. Cities like Munich, Venice, and perhaps even Rome itself might have faced the Ottoman armies. The Holy Roman Empire could have collapsed under the weight of Turkish dominance, and the Christian world would have been forever fractured. Instead, thanks to the combined strength of the Holy League, the narrative shifted. Europe was no longer the hunted, it had become the hunter. In the aftermath of the Ottoman defeat, a new confidence swept across Christian Europe. The psychological impact was immense. The Ottoman military, once regarded as invincible, was proven vulnerable. The massive cavalry charge led by Sobieski and the devastating collapse of the Ottoman lines shattered the aura of Ottoman supremacy. From that day forward, the empire would no longer be seen as an unstoppable force pressing against Europe's borders. Instead, it became a declining power, gradually pushed back over the course of the next century. The Habsburg dynasty, long struggling to hold its lands together against Ottoman pressure, suddenly found itself in a position of renewed strength. Vienna, which had nearly been lost, became a symbol of resilience and survival. Under Habsburg leadership, the Holy Roman Empire and its allies began reclaiming territories that had been lost to the Ottomans in previous decades. Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans would slowly but surely be taken back. The Great Turkish War that followed Vienna was essentially the unraveling of Ottoman control in Central Europe. But beyond the immediate military gains, the battle had enormous cultural and symbolic consequences. It became a rallying point for European unity. The idea that diverse kingdoms, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and others, could set aside rivalries and fight together against a common enemy carried profound weight. The Holy League, forged in the fires of Vienna, demonstrated that Europe could act as a collective force when faced with existential threats. It was this same spirit of unity that would later fuel the Enlightenment and shape the rise of modern nation-states. For the Ottoman Empire, the loss at Vienna was a devastating blow. Kara Mustafa Pasha, who had dreamed of parading into Vienna as a conqueror, was executed for his failure. More importantly, the empire's momentum was broken. No longer would the Ottomans be able to threaten the heart of Europe with the same ferocity. Their frontier shifted from being an expanding edge of conquest to a contested border of defense. Over time, as Europe entered a period of rapid scientific, military, and industrial advancement, the Ottomans lagged behind, their empire stagnating under the weight of old traditions and internal strife. This shift in power was not just geopolitical, it was civilizational. The survival of Vienna ensured that Europe's intellectual, cultural, and religious traditions would continue to flourish. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution had already begun reshaping Europe. And without the existential threat of Ottoman dominance, these movements could grow freely. The Enlightenment, which followed in the 18th century, would spread ideas of reason, liberty, and progress that transformed the Western world. All of this might have been derailed or delayed had the Ottomans taken Vienna. The symbolic clash between the Cross and the Crescent at Vienna has echoed throughout history. It represented not just a military struggle, but a battle for identity, faith, and the future of Europe. To many contemporaries, the victory was seen as divine intervention, a sign that Christendom had been spared. To modern historians, it was a turning point where the balance of global power shifted decisively westward. The Ottomans, still formidable, were now on the defensive. Europe, divided and fractious though it often was, had demonstrated that its combined strength could resist and repel even the most determined of invasions. From a military perspective, the Battle of Vienna also marked a change in the art of war. The success of combined arms tactics, the integration of infantry, artillery, and cavalry in coordinated maneuvers foreshadowed the future of European warfare. The legendary charge of the Winged Hussars, while dramatic, was effective precisely because it was supported by careful planning, artillery bombardment, and infantry advances. It showcased a level of coordination and discipline that would define European armies in the centuries to come. Looking back, the battle's legacy is as much about what didn't happen as what did. Europe did not fall under Ottoman domination. Vienna did not become another Constantinople. The Holy Roman Empire did not collapse into ruins. Instead, the survival of Vienna set the stage for a Europe that would rise to global dominance in the centuries that followed. Colonial empires, scientific revolutions, and industrial advancements, all of these were made possible in part because the heart of Europe remained free. In this sense, the Battle of Vienna was not just a turning point in a war. It was a turning point in world history. It marked the end of one era, the long advance of the Ottoman Empire, and the beginning of another, where Europe would surge forward, shaping the modern world. The echoes of cannon fire on the Kohlenberg Heights still remind us of the fragile balance of history, where a single day's battle can decide the fate of civilizations. Thus, the fields outside Vienna were not only a battlefield, they were a crossroads of destiny. On September 12, 1683, the course of Europe and, by extension, the course of the entire world was forever changed. The Ottomans would never again push so deep into the continent, and the Habsburgs, along with their allies, would emerge stronger, leading Europe into a new age. The victory at Vienna stands as a defining moment when the tide of history turned, sealing the fate of empires and shaping the world we live in today. The dust of battle had barely settled on the fields outside Vienna when the true meaning of the Christian coalition's triumph began to unfold. For contemporaries, the relief of Vienna was nothing short of miraculous. For historians, it was a defining moment that ignited a new era of unity, resilience, and momentum across Europe. The victory was not simply the salvation of a single city. It was the catalyst for a profound shift, one that would usher in a new phase of warfare, politics, and cultural identity. The Battle of Vienna became the cornerstone upon which the great edifice of European resurgence against the Ottomans was built, inspiring generations to come. To understand its legacy, one must first appreciate the sense of dread that had gripped Europe prior to 1683. For centuries, the Ottomans had seemed invincible, their armies sweeping across the Balkans, Hungary, and into the heart of Central Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had been a trauma that echoed through Christendom. Belgrade, Rhodes, Cyprus, and much of Hungary had all fallen under the Crescent. When the Ottoman army surrounded Vienna with 150,000 men, few believed the city could hold. Yet, when it did, and when the enemy was not only repelled but utterly crushed, the psychological weight of fear was lifted. The legend of Ottoman invincibility was shattered forever. This sudden reversal sparked a new spirit of determination among Christian rulers. Pope Innocent XI, who had labored tirelessly to rally a divided Christendom before the siege, now found his efforts vindicated. His call for unity had been answered in dramatic fashion. John III Sobieski, the Polish king, hailed as the savior of Vienna, became a living legend, a symbol of Christian valor. Across Europe, from the courts of Rome to the palaces of Paris, from the castles of Bavaria to the towns of Poland, people rejoiced. Bells rang in celebration, and sermons proclaimed the victory as an act of divine providence. It was not merely a military triumph, it was a spiritual and cultural rebirth. The political consequences were equally significant. Out of the victory at Vienna emerged the Holy League, a coalition of Christian states united under papal guidance to continue the fight against the Ottomans. For too long, the kingdoms of Europe had quarreled among themselves, divided by dynastic rivalries and religious differences. Protestants and Catholics alike had often looked at one another with more suspicion than they did the Turks. But the battle demonstrated what could be achieved when Europe set aside its differences to confront a common enemy. The Holy League would become a powerful instrument of collective defense, paving the way for future victories. The Great Turkish War, which followed in the wake of Vienna, was the direct child of this renewed unity. For nearly 2 decades, Christian armies pushed relentlessly against the Ottomans, reclaiming lost lands and fortresses. Hungary, which had languished under Ottoman domination, was gradually liberated. Transylvania, Croatia, and parts of the Balkans shifted back into European control. The war culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a monumental agreement that forced the Ottoman Empire to cede vast territories to the Habsburgs, Poland, and Venice. This treaty marked the first major territorial rollback of Ottoman power in Europe, a reversal made possible only because of the momentum created at Vienna. The legacy of Vienna also extended into the realm of identity. For centuries, Europeans had seen themselves as fragmented peoples: French, German, Polish, Spanish, Italian, and more often locked in bitter conflicts with one another. But the defense of Vienna revealed a deeper, shared consciousness. They began to recognize themselves as part of a greater whole. Christendom, a civilization bound not only by faith, but also by common values, culture, and destiny. The Ottoman threat had inadvertently forged a stronger sense of European identity. This cultural cohesion would, in time, help propel Europe into its age of exploration, empire, and global influence. Symbolically, the victory at Vienna was remembered as a battle of civilizations. It was framed as the triumph of the cross over the crescent, of Christendom over Islam. While such narratives were often colored by religious fervor and propaganda, they underscored the extent to which the battle shaped the imagination of Europe. Paintings, poems, songs, and plays immortalized the heroism of Sobieski and the Winged Hussars. Churches commissioned artworks celebrating the Virgin Mary as the protectress of Vienna. The story of the battle became woven into the cultural fabric of Europe, passed down from generation to generation. Even in the realm of everyday life, echoes of the battle lingered. Legend has it that as the Ottomans fled, they left behind sacks of coffee, which the Viennese adopted and transformed into the famous Viennese coffeehouse culture. While partly myth, the story captures how the battle entered the folklore of Europe not just as a tale of war, but as a turning point that touched all aspects of life. Croissants, too, were supposedly baked in celebration, their crescent shape symbolizing the defeated enemy now consumed at the breakfast table. Whether true or apocryphal, such stories reveal the depth of cultural impact Vienna's salvation had on the European psyche. The Ottomans, meanwhile, faced a very different legacy. The defeat marked the beginning of a long decline. No longer could the empire project its power so far into Central Europe. Instead, it became locked in a cycle of defensive wars, internal struggles, and gradual territorial loss. The execution of Kara Mustafa Pasha, blamed for the disaster, symbolized the desperation within the empire's leadership. The balance of power had shifted, and from this point onward, the Ottomans would increasingly fight to hold what they had, rather than seize what they desired. The broader implications extended beyond Europe and the Ottoman frontier. The victory at Vienna emboldened European powers to turn their attention outward. Secure in the knowledge that the Ottoman threat had been checked, Western Europe expanded its horizons across the oceans. The same century that saw Vienna saved also saw the rapid growth of colonial empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Europe's ability to unify against a powerful external enemy demonstrated the organizational strength that would soon be applied on a global scale. Vienna, in a sense, was one of the stepping stones that allowed Europe to transition from a continent under siege to one that would dominate the world stage. In hindsight, the legacy of Vienna is one of resilience, renewal, and transformation. It was not the end of conflict, far from it, but it was the beginning of the end for Ottoman dominance in Europe. It was the moment when Europe seized back the initiative, when the fear that had haunted its borders for centuries gave way to hope and ambition. The battle proved that unity could achieve what division never could, and it planted the seeds of a stronger European identity. More than 3 centuries later, the Battle of Vienna remains a symbol of what can be accomplished in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that history can pivot on the courage of a few, the vision of leaders, and the will of nations to act as one. Its legacy endures not only in the history books, but in the very fabric of Europe, whose survival and resurgence in 1683 shaped the world we live in today. The cannons of Vienna did more than shatter stone walls and scatter armies. They echoed across centuries as the sound of two civilizations colliding. The Battle of Vienna in 1683 was not simply a military engagement between opposing armies. It was remembered as the defining clash of East versus West. The moment when two worlds, Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire, met in a confrontation that symbolized far more than the fate of a single city. It was a battle of identities, of religions, of cultural pride and imperial ambition. To contemporaries, and to those who would later tell its story, Vienna was more than a battlefield. It was a stage upon which the destiny of civilizations was contested. For centuries leading up to that fateful September day, the Ottoman Empire had embodied the power and dominance of the East. Emerging from Anatolia, it had conquered Constantinople in 1453, forever altering the balance of power between Christendom and Islam. The crescent banner spread across the Balkans, Hungary, and the Mediterranean, its armies feared and its fleets respected. For Europeans, the Ottomans were not merely another kingdom, they were the other, a rival civilization whose advance threatened not just borders but the very essence of European identity. The fall of Constantinople had been a wound that never healed, a reminder of Europe's vulnerability. Vienna, in 1683, became the chance to reverse that humiliation, to draw a line in history where East and West would confront each other head-on. The Ottomans, for their part, saw themselves as heirs of empire. They claimed the mantle of Rome through their possession of Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, and carried the ambition of universal sovereignty. Their rulers were not just political leaders, but caliphs, defenders of Islam, tasked with expanding the faith into lands yet For Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the campaign against Vienna was not simply a military expedition, it was a holy endeavor. To march into Vienna was to strike at the heart of Christendom, to announce to the world that the Ottoman crescent was ascendant and that the gates of Europe lay open before it. Thus, when 150,000 Ottoman troops encircled Vienna, it was not just the city's survival that hung in the balance. To the defenders and their allies, the siege symbolized the survival of Christian Europe itself. When Pope Innocent XI rallied kingdoms to form the Holy League, he did so not only as a political leader, but as a spiritual one. The war cry of the Crusader spirit echoed again, framing the coming battle as a holy war to preserve Christendom. When King John III, Sobieski of Poland, rode with his Winged Hussars into the fray, he was not just a monarch defending an ally. He was cast as a savior of the West. The imagery of the battle reinforced this perception. On the morning of September 12, 1683, As the Allied armies prepared to charge from the Kohlenberg heights, priests held mass, blessing the soldiers and raising the cross before the troops. Sobieski himself is said to have prayed before leading his cavalry down the slopes. On the Ottoman side, imams preached of victory and divine favor, urging the soldiers to complete their conquest of Vienna in the name of the faith. Both armies saw themselves as champions of a civilization, fighting not only for land but for the supremacy of their way of life. When the battle turned, and the Winged Hussars charged in what became the largest cavalry assault in history, the outcome was more than a tactical collapse. The flight of the Ottoman army was seen as a spiritual and cultural defeat. To Christian Europe, it was proof that divine providence favored their cause. To the Ottomans, it was a devastating blow to their aura of invincibility. The clash became a symbol of civilizational struggle, one side defending its homeland and faith, the other striving to fulfill an imperial and religious mission. In the years that followed, the memory of Vienna was mythologized as a civilizational turning point. For Europeans, it became the story of how East was halted by West, how Christendom stood united against the advancing Crescent. The battle was framed as a moment of divine intervention, a miracle of salvation. Sobieski was immortalized as the savior of Vienna. His charge remembered not just as a military maneuver, but as the hand of God in motion. This narrative reinforced Europe's sense of cultural superiority and unity at a time when it was emerging into the Enlightenment and preparing to assert itself on the global stage. The Ottomans, conversely, carried the scar of Vienna as the moment their expansion into Europe reached its high-water mark. Though their empire remained vast and powerful, their mystique of unstoppable conquest was broken. From that point forward, they would be seen increasingly as a declining empire, forced onto the defensive, gradually losing ground to the west. The symbolic weight of the defeat extended beyond territory. It shaped how the Ottomans and Europeans perceived each other for generations to come. The battle's symbolic dimension extended even into culture and folklore. Vienna's survival became a source of artistic and literary celebration across Europe. Painters depicted the Winged Hussars descending from the heavens, bathed in light, as if angels themselves had intervened. Poets wrote of the victory as the salvation of Europe. In popular legend, the spoils left behind by the Ottomans gave birth to Vienna-esque coffeehouse culture and the crescent-shaped croissant, turning the symbols of Ottoman culture into trophies of Christian triumph. These stories, whether factual or exaggerated, reinforced the idea of Vienna as not just a battlefield but a civilizational victory. The idea of East versus West crystallized in Vienna would echo long after the cannons fell silent. Historians and political thinkers of later centuries often pointed to the battle as the moment when the West asserted itself against the East, setting the stage for Europe's rise to global dominance. It became a reference point in discussions of cultural identity, a shorthand for the resilience of Western civilization in the face of external threats. Even in modern times, the Battle of Vienna is invoked in debates about the clash of civilizations, religious conflict, and the shaping of Europe's cultural borders. Yet it is important to recognize that the battle's symbolic weight was not merely about division. In many ways, Vienna also represented the power of unity. The victory was only possible because Christian Europe overcame its internal rivalries and stood together. Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, and Saxons fought side by side. Catholic and Protestant princes set aside differences to repel the Ottomans. The battle thus symbolized not only a clash of civilizations, but also the possibility of cooperation within Europe itself, a unity forged in crisis that would prove essential for the continent's survival and later prosperity. In the grand sweep of history, the Battle of Vienna stands as a moment where two civilizations tested each other as strength and resolve. It was a crucible in which faith, identity, and destiny collided. The clash of East and West at Vienna shaped the way both sides saw themselves and each other, influencing not only the outcome of wars but the very narrative of world history. For Europe, it was a defining triumph that fueled confidence and unity. For the Ottomans, it was a sobering reminder of limits and the beginning of decline. More than 300 years later, Vienna remains etched in memory as one of the most decisive confrontations between civilizations. It was the day when the thunder of hooves and the roar of cannon fire decided not just a city's fate, but the symbolic future of a continent. The East met the West on the slopes of the Kohlenberg, and the world was never the same again. As the final echoes of battle faded over the fields of Vienna on September 12, 1683, history had been rewritten. What began as a desperate defense of a besieged city had transformed into one of the most decisive turning points in the eternal struggle between empires, cultures, and faiths. The victory was not merely military, it was civilizational. It was the day the tide of Ottoman expansion was halted, the day Europe discovered the power of unity, and the day the clash of East and West became immortalized in legend. The Battle of Vienna was more than a confrontation between two armies. It was a moment when centuries of tension, ambition, and fear collided in a single, decisive clash. On one side stood the Ottoman Empire, vast, ambitious, and determined to press its influence deeper into the heart of Europe. On the other stood a fragile coalition of Christian kingdoms, bound together not by choice but by necessity, united under the looming shadow of annihilation. In that moment of crisis, leaders and ordinary soldiers alike rose to greatness, carving their names into history. The legacy of the battle reaches far beyond the cannons and cavalry charges. It marked the end of an era, the end of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. No longer would the empire march confidently across the continent. From Vienna onward, the Ottomans would slowly recede, their once unshakable power eroded by the advancing strength of Europe. At the same time, the Christian victory breathed life into the idea of a united Europe, a collective Christendom capable of overcoming rivalries when survival demanded it. The Holy League, born in the fires of Vienna, proved that even fractured nations could stand as one when destiny called. And yet, beyond politics and territory, the battle's significance lay in the realm of symbolism. For Europeans, it became the triumph of the cross over the crescent, of survival over conquest. For the Ottomans, it was a sobering moment, the realization that their empire's momentum was not infinite. The battle's memory was woven into art, literature, religion, and folklore painted on canvases, sung in hymns, told in sermons. Its legends were passed down in stories of croissants shaped like crescents, coffee houses born from the spoils of war, and of course, the unforgettable charge of the Winged Hussars, the thunder of hooves that changed the world. When we look back on Vienna, we must also remember that history is not simply a tale of victors and vanquished. It is a mirror. It shows us what is possible when human beings are driven by ambition, faith, fear, and courage. It reminds us that empires rise and fall, that no power is eternal, and that unity can overcome even the darkest of threats. The fields outside Vienna, soaked with the blood of thousands, became the proving ground for Europe's future. From that moment, the balance of power tilted westward, setting the stage for the Enlightenment, the rise of the nation-state, and the global dominance of European civilization in centuries to come. As the dust settled, Vienna was saved, but more importantly, a continent had been spared. The cannon fire of 1683 was more than the sound of war, it was the sound of history pivoting. Had the Ottomans broken through, the world we know today might look very different. Instead, the story became one of resilience, defiance, and victory. The story of how 80,000 Crusaders defeated 150,000 Ottomans. The story of how a city stood its ground, and how civilizations collided in one of the most dramatic confrontations in history. And now, centuries later, we stand as the inheritors of that legacy. The Battle of Vienna is not just a story of the past, it is a lesson. A reminder that unity can triumph over division, that courage can overcome fear, and that even in the darkest hour, destiny can be reshaped by the will of those who refuse to yield. So, what do we take from this? We take the knowledge that history matters, that the past is not a distant shadow, but a living force that shapes our present and our future. We take the inspiration of those who fought at Vienna, men who faced overwhelming odds yet held firm because they knew what was at stake. And we take the understanding that the struggles of civilizations are not merely about swords and cannons. They are about identity, belief, and the enduring human quest for survival. And now, dear viewer, the story passes to you. If this journey through the Battle of Vienna has sparked your imagination, if it has made you reflect on the fragility of history and the courage of those who came before us, then join us in keeping these stories alive. History is not just dates and names, it is the pulse of humanity. It is the narrative of who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most decisive battles, then make sure you like this video to show your support. Share it with others who love history, so that together we can spread the lessons of the past to those who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because this is only one story among many. Here, we uncover forgotten wars, legendary leaders, and the epic struggles that shaped civilizations. By subscribing, you won't just be following a channel, you'll be joining a community of thinkers, learners, and storytellers who believe history is worth remembering, and we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the Battle of Vienna? Do you believe it was truly the decisive turning point between East and West? How do you see its legacy echoing into the modern world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could spark a conversation that connects us all. Finally, if you want to continue this journey, explore the other great battles we've covered, from the clash at Lepanto to the fields of Waterloo. Each story adds a new piece to the puzzle of human history, reminding us that our present is built on the sacrifices, triumphs, and failures of those who came before. So, as we close this chapter, remember this: the past is never dead. It speaks to us if we are willing to listen. The Battle of Vienna, fought over 3 centuries ago, still whispers lessons of courage, unity, and destiny. Let us carry those lessons forward, not just as stories, but as guides for our own journey through history. Thank you for watching. This has been the story of how 80,000 Crusaders destroyed 150,000 Ottomans at the Battle of Vienna. A story of East versus West, of ambition and resilience, of a world forever changed by a single day's struggle. Until next time, keep seeking the past, keep questioning the present, and keep imagining the future. This is not the end. It is only the beginning of our shared journey through history.